The 25 impossible technologies they buried to control you. The lights went out across the valley at 6:14 p.m., and the town didn't care. Their meters sat at zero while a gray metal box in a maintenance shed hummed like a fridge. 6 weeks later, a utility truck arrived with lawyers and a crane. The box vanished. The bills came back. You've heard whispers, engines that sip no fuel, therapies that end whole service lines, networks you can't turn off. Tonight, we're not trading theories. We're following paper trails, expired patents, declassified memos, and labs that went quiet. Because if these devices are real, they don't just cut your bill, they cut somebody's leash. The promise, urgency, and roadmap. Here's the frame. Control rides on 3 rails: your meter, your body, your feed. Break those rails and the gatekeepers wobble. So we're grouping 25 buried technologies into 3 pillars: energy liberation, forbidden medicine, and control killing information tech. Why now? A stack of doors just unlocked. Patents that parked inventions in legal purgatory through the 199s and 200s are expiring. Classification stamps from the 196s, 197s, and 198s are peeling off memos. Whistleblowers, engineers, procurement officers, clinical leads are retiring and talking. And the economics have shifted. What was fringe in 1999 is viable at scale in 2026, which makes suppression obvious when the math finally pencils out. Start with energy. Anything that kills recurring bills meets a hammer. We'll follow solid-state power concepts that promised quiet sheets turning heat gradients into electricity, ambient harvesters pulling trickles from radio, vibration, and temperature flicker to make mesh sensors immortal, synthetic fuels turning carbon back into liquid energy without refineries or pipelines, thin film solar that hit sub-dollar in small runs long before store shelves, and high-density batteries that changed owners and disappeared into roadmaps. The stakes aren't abstract. When a box in your garage replaces a monthly payment, revenue streams, currencies pegged to barrels, and geopolitical leverage all feel it. Then medicine. Healthcare earns when patients return. One-and-done repairs, gene edits, off-the-shelf cell therapies, printed organs, threaten annuity diseases. We'll trace Phage Therapy's century-old record and its modern regulatory maze. Multi-cancer blood screens and breath analyzers that drag diagnoses left on the timeline where treatment is shorter, cheaper, and less brutal. Devices and implants that close loops in diabetes and pain without refills. You'll hear from families who flew overseas because a therapy worked there, not here, yet. Finally, information. Whoever routes the signal writes the story. We'll walk through phone-to-phone mesh that routes around blackouts and bans, brain like analog and neuromorphic chips that put serious compute at the edge so the cloud can't be the choke point, and zero-knowledge proofs that verify identity, assets, or documents without exposing the data, killing the excuse to hoard it in central vaults. When you can prove something without permission, a surprising number of doors don't need a guard. Open loops to keep in mind. One device ran a town for 6 weeks after a storm, until the paperwork arrived. One diagnostic cut late-stage chemotherapy cycles so sharply an entire service line faced extinction, and procurement stalled. One publishing network refused takedowns so completely that the only play left was to pressure the pipes. We're not saying everything works as advertised. We're saying the patterns repeat, interest, pressure, pause. So here's the roadmap. The tech that blows up the world's meter, the cures that break business models, the protocols that make gatekeepers optional, receipts along the way, names where we can, and when we can't, we'll show you why. Energy liberation, the threat to meters. To see why the hammer falls hardest on energy, follow the invoice. Every house, factory, base, metered. That meter is a subscription disguised as infrastructure. Break the subscription and you don't just lower a bill, you remove leverage, prices steer elections. Fuel contracts steady currencies, maintenance becomes patronage. A garage device that delivers steady power isn't a gadget, it's an unvoted policy. Policy gets defended. Engineers kept pushing anyway along 3 routes. First, turn waste heat into electricity with no moving parts. Second, sip power from the environment so small loads never need the grid. Third, make liquid fuels locally so pipelines stop being choke points. Different paths, same threat. Recurring revenue becomes a one-time purchase. Start in the rooms that run too hot. Foundries, data centers, refineries, rivers of heat blown into the air. For decades, the promise was solid-state converters that turn a temperature difference into current. Early thermionics needed furnaces. Later, nano-engineered surfaces nudged emission toward room temperature. Quiet sheets on warm walls produced a whisper of power, multiplied by surface area into real money. Patent families split into continuations. Licenses drifted to holding companies. The public line stayed safe, promising not yet scalable. Behind fences, pilots shaved peak draw where press couldn't see, and forecasts looked strangely off. Why do slivers matter? Industrial math add up the fractions. 5% off a plant's draw moves profit, cancels capex, and disturbs the debt beneath it. That's when standards bodies ask for lifetime data, insurers invent new categories, and regulators wonder about uncharacterized emissions from shielded leads. Each request seems prudent. Together, they become a maze. Startups miss runways while incumbents bank rate cases on yesterday's load. Meanwhile, honest scavenging got practical, not free energy bookkeeping. Cities leak power in radio, vibration, temperature flicker. Ultra-low-power chips made those scraps useful. Rural co-ops anchored soil sensors in the wash of FM towers and the hum of grain dryers. Nodes woke, measured, whispered across phone-to-phone mesh, then slept. No batteries to swap, no trucks to roll. A storm snapped poles, the mesh rerouted like water. For 6 weeks, the town had data without bills. Then envelopes arrived. Firmware locks bricked nodes until they phoned home. Security, updates disabled sideloading on municipal devices unless a portal fee cleared. Regulators forwarded friendly reminders about authorization for equipment that didn't even transmit. The effect was simple: keep endpoints dependent. Skeptics shrug, harvesters don't threaten big meters, but cut millions of tiny bills, batteries, service visits, carrier plans, and you hollow quiet revenue columns that fund the center. Each self-sufficient node is a small veto on someone else's forecast. Enough vetoes shift the balance. Then came the fuel lever. Cities and militaries need energy that stores, pours, and survives logistics. Synthetic fuels CO2+ hydrogen back into diesel, kerosene, gasoline always failed on cost. Catalysts and electrolyzers bent the curve. A municipal site captured flue CO2, used off-peak wind to split water, and fed a compact reactor. Output hit diesel spec. Buses ran cleaner. Optimization pause followed. Interconnection studies reopened over harmonics. Insurance riders spiked. An oil-aligned investor bought control. Strategic review, staff said the tech worked. The rollout had timing risk. Defense ran its own quiet trials. Bases don't like convoys. Container units drank seawater, harvested CO2, split hydrogen with nighttime baseload, and synthesized JP8. Engines wore normally. Reports stayed inside. Orders didn't. Public markets never got the signal. You saw smaller skirmishes everywhere. Thin-film solar hit sub-dollar per watt in small runs long before it hit shelves. Tooling was bought, then mothballed after acquisitions. Trade complaints raised import costs. Incumbents inked long PPAs under yesterday's prices. A couple of towns slipped through. Solar canopies over parking lots, storage from an unacquired startup, islanding firmware published openly. After the next storm, their grocery aisles stayed cold and their pumps worked. Reporters called it luck. The spreadsheet called it threat modeling. Battery stories rhymed. High-density chemistries flashed better energy and brutal fast-charge life. A stealth buy followed. Roadmaps aligned to legacy cells. Spec sheets vanished. Teams were absorbed. Supercapacitors with million-cycle lives impressed utilities in DMOS. Partners insisted on exclusivity. Founders signed, product names changed to developer kit, and nothing shipped. Permitting became a weapon of attrition. Tidal microturbines that hum under predictable currents met navigation reviews that never ended. Local wind that would stabilize microgrids faced wildlife studies cloned across counties. Storage systems that competed with demand response triggered sudden safety bulletins. None of it looked like sabotage. All of it felt like delay. The human beats keep this from turning into theory. A plant manager who watched a heat harvest pilot cut peak draw by 3% got an email from corporate finance asking why load forecasts justifying a bond issue had shifted. A co-op engineer taught teenagers to flash mesh firmware before a carrier update killed sideloading. A process lead topped a drum of synthetic diesel before a pause and kept a hospital generator alive when tankers couldn't dock. Limits exist. Thermionics at near ambient fight degradation. Harvesters can't run fridges. Synthetic fuel costs depend on cheap power and catalyst life. But those are engineering curves, and they're bending. The unusual part isn't the physics. It's how predictably interference arrives when bills disappear. So you learn the rule set. When a box in your garage turns a subscription into an appliance, standards multiply. When a sensor runs on air, firmware grows a leash. When a town prints fuel from wind and waste, interconnects reopen. Interest pressure pause. And yet some units keep humming behind doors with hand-painted signs, some meshes keep breathing when towers go dark, and somewhere a bus still runs on a drum labeled in Sharpie. Solid-state power, the Room-Temp thermionic dream. The first rumor sounded like boiler room folklore. 2 polished plates, a hair of vacuum, a measurable temperature difference, and a steady trickle of current with no moving parts. Early thermionics in the 1940s and 1950s needed heat you could feel across a room. This version flirted with ambient. If it held, a factory wall became a generator, an exhaust stack a quiet charger, a data center's heat a feed for its own sensors. To see why that mattered, go to a lab notebook in 1962 where an engineer logged currents that refused to vanish into noise. He stacked wafers, tuned coatings, shaved work functions like a locksmith. When the room warmed, the curve lifted. When a winter draft crept in, it sank. Not perpetual, just stubborn. A provisional patent landed months later. Continuations multiplied, claims narrowed, and a license transferred to a Delaware holding company with no product catalog and a very good lawyer. What nobody outside the badge readers saw, 2 pilot tiles went to a field partner. One returned dented with no feedback. The other never came back. The inventor, call him Alex, sat across from a man who never touched the coffee and signed a buyout with an advisory role and a clause that reached into his future. No independent work, substantially similar in purpose or effect. He moved apartments. He stopped answering emails from old colleagues. Meanwhile, materials science crawled closer to the dream. Nanostructured emitters etched forests of sharp tips. Low work function coatings fought degradation. Microvacuum gaps stabilized with MEMS tricks. Thermoelectronic quietly replaced thermionic in abstracts. A university demo lit an LED on a hot plate with a palm cooling the other side. The video made it to forums, then disappeared behind a tech transfer claim. The grad student defended, then took a private sector job at a firm famous for buying IP it never shipped. Stakes were simple enough to write in a CFO email. A thin, bolt-on sheet that harvests a few percent of a hot surface at scale-dense baseload forecasts. Dented forecasts weaken rate cases and the debt they anchor. Weak debt moves stock. That's when standards committees ask for cycling data that takes years, insurers want a certification category that doesn't exist, and a regulator wonders whether unshielded leads might radiate uncharacterized signatures, even when they're shielded and the signatures aren't there. Each request reads reasonable. In sequence, they become a runway eater. While that was happening in New York, a foundry in Texas tested arrayed emitters gated like a field emission display wired backward. A glass plant wrapped a section of furnace with tiles, saw a 3% shave off peak, and noticed cooling loads eased. The company's next press release used a phrase engineers dread, refocusing on core competencies. A week later, the IP portfolio grew by acquisition, and pilot units were recalled for upgrades. They never reappeared. Defense labs, as usual, had a different motivation: stealth and resilience. A sealed room ran racks with thermoelectronic skins that scavenged waste heat for monitoring while passively cooling hot spots. No fans, no signatures, papers didn't publish. Budgets did. The grid world never saw a spec sheet. Skeptics have fair arrows. Near-ambient emission fights contamination, drift, and fatigue. Maintaining microgaps across seasons is hard. Matching lab-grade vacuum tricks with factory abuse is harder. But hard isn't fake, and pilots that shave real kilowatts tell their own story. The pattern we watched wasn't hype collapsing under physics. It was credible gains slowed by admin gravity. A micro story cuts cleaner than any chart. In 2021, a Midwestern plant manager watched telemetry during a 6-week thermoelectronic trial. Peaks softened, cooling compressors cycled less, and the Thursday forecast he sent corporate shaved just enough to nudge a bond conversation. Finance asked for consistency. The pilot extension slid behind a broader review, and the crate left the dock with a return label and silence inside. Another vignette: a vineyard strapped tiles to fermentation rooms to reclaim the warmth of yeast. Not a revolution, just enough edge to run pumps off hours and keep a genset quiet. They posted a photo. A distributor forwarded a friendly reminder about equipment approval categories that didn't include energy scavenging panels. They moved the photo to a private chat and kept the panels. Here's the quiet impact. Even at single-digit efficiency, thermoelectronic skins on ovens, kilns, smelters, engine bays, and racks add up to city-scale megawatts you don't buy. Prices move at the margins. If enough walls make their own trickle, the grid's leverage thins where it's fattest. Predictable demand. That's when the maze shows up. Lifetime tests longer than cash. Harmonized standards that harmonize to yesterday. Safety reviews scoped to mechanical generators applied to sealed sheets. Limits remain. Coatings fatigue. Seals fail. Fouling happens. But those are engineering curves and they bend with use. What bends slower is permission. The buyouts keep coming, the NDAs keep stretching. The phrase pre-commercial keeps buying time for everyone except the team paying rent. The last note is human. Alex kept tinkering in his kitchen anyway, different geometry, new gaps, the same itch. He never shipped a product under his name again. But somewhere behind a door with a hand-painted sign, a warm wall hums slightly less than it used to, and a breaker trips a little later on hot afternoons. That whisper is the dream, not free energy, just less to rent. Ambient energy harvesters, radio, vibration, and the air around us. If heat gave you a trickle, the air gave you a whisper, and whispers add up when circuits learn to live on almost nothing. This wasn't magic, it was bookkeeping. Cities leak energy all day, radio broadcasts, Wi-Fi splash, cell towers, switching supplies that sing in harmonics, doors that slam, rails that hum, pipes that tremble, walls that breathe temperature. For a century, crystal radios proved you could listen on the signal itself. The modern twist was silicon that sipped nanowatts and woke only to speak. Stakes first, when devices live on scraps, you stop paying to keep them alive. No battery budgets, no truck rolls to swap coin cells, no service contracts to monitor a thing that can monitor itself. One node is a neat trick. 10,000 across a town is a line item gone. The people who sell the tires, the batteries, the plans, and the dashboards feel that subtraction before anyone else reads a press release. Action looks small at first. A land-grant lab-tuned postage stamp rectinas to the local FM band and paired them with ultra-low leakage capacitors. In fields outside town, soil probes woke every hour, measured moisture and conductivity, relayed a few bytes through a sleepy mesh, and went back to dreaming, all from the wash of radio a tractor cab can't hear. A county agriculture office watched water use drop and fuel costs follow. The farmer's summary was cleaner. I don't send anyone out there anymore. Meanwhile, in a transit system that couldn't afford outages, vibration-powered housekeeping. Millimeter piezo strips sat under rails and turnstiles, trickled charging caps that fed safety beacons and counters. The old plan called for quarterly battery changes and surprise failures. The new plan called for a sweep once a year to dust. Maintenance loved it until legal flagged RF compliance. The devices didn't transmit. The memo didn't care. What nobody outside the utility hallways saw was the phone call sequence when a rural co-op built a real mesh. Line-of-sight nodes on silos, phone-to-phone relays in pockets, and harvesters on the edge. A blizzard took poles, the network rerouted like water. Wells pinged, gates opened, frost lines reported. 6 weeks later, envelopes arrived. A carrier-piloted managed IoT, offering certified modules and remote updates. The co-op's endpoints ran open firmware. A security update on branded phones disabled sideloading unless devices enrolled in a portal with a fee and a clause. Remote disable to preserve network integrity. A regulator forwarded friendly reminders about equipment authorization for devices that only listened. A baseband patch bricked a third of the nodes until they re-enrolled. The sales team called 5 minutes later. Stakes sharpened in spreadsheets. Batteries are quiet money. Procurement, disposal, labor lost sensors when schedules slip. Replace tens of thousands with boards that eat RF crumbs and vibration, and you erase a revenue column that pays for the center. Add mesh hops that prefer neighbors over towers, and you soften a bill that underwrites fiber and uplinks. None of this looks dramatic on a map. It looks like the middle getting thinner. Action kept multiplying. In a high-rise, a Nordic startup tuned scavengers to office soup, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, RFID doors, and fed e-ink occupancy tags. Cleaners hit rooms that needed them. Property managers smiled until an integrator's survey flagged unauthorized radios. The tags didn't radiate. The rollout paused pending risk assessment. In schools, thermoelectric slivers on window frames lived on daily temperature swing and powered CO2 sensors. Headaches fell when windows opened at the right time. A facility's memo demanded battery replacement plans. There were no batteries. A hospital trial strapped harvesters to bed rails to track utilization. Biomed loved the uptime. It demanded cloud authentication for endpoints that didn't speak to the cloud. Then the smear cycle kicked in. Trade press ran a soft headline. Are energy harvesters a safety risk? The concerns were fog, unknown electromagnetic effects, privacy, ending on a quote about standardized gateways and managed updates. Translation, harvest, but through us. The same week, a carrier pushed a firmware hardening that blocked peer-to-peer radios unless a SIM was blessed. Municipal crews found their side-loaded mesh app refused to launch after an update. The vendor offered a compliant distribution for a monthly fee. Limits are real. RF is fickle, vibration is seasonal, temperature flicker shrinks in a narrow climate band, rectifiers leak, capacitors age. Loads must be ruthlessly small and patient, but those are engineering curves, not theology. Boards now run on microwatts, wake on motion, transmit in milliseconds, sleep for weeks, and borrow diversity from the environment. A little RF here, some tremor there, a daily breath from the wall, sunlight when it visits. The constraint, don't send unless you mean it, forces good design. Impact arrived in places that don't write memos. A bridge authority cut truck rolls by half when strained nodes lived off traffic vibration. A water utility used analog classifiers at the edge with scavenged power to distinguish leaks from construction noise. No cloud, no subpoenas, just counts. A warehouse printed e-ink labels powered by RFID reflections and stopped paying a subscription for screens that failed at the rate of their batteries. The bills that didn't arrive never made news. Defense validated the hunch quietly. In disaster drills, teams dropped phone-free terrain networks with harvesters and watched them run for weeks without logistics tails. After action notes read, resiliency unaffected by prolonged outage. The finding never made a civilian standard. Civilian standards made enrollment portals instead. The human cut holds it together. A teenager on a farm learned to flash firmware before a carrier update locked sideloading. A janitor in a tower tapped a tag that lived on the air and cleaned the right floor at the right hour without anyone's permission. A nurse checked a bed that finally told the truth about whether a patient was there. None of them paid a monthly fee for the privilege. That's what the fight is about, not Watts, custody, who decides whether a whisper is enough. Synthetic fuels that break the barrel. While harvesters quietly starved small bills, the fuel fight went for the throat. Liquids you can make anywhere that pour, store, and fly. Not corn politics, drop-in molecules, diesel, kerosene, gasoline made from carbon pulled back out of the air and hydrogen split from water. The physics is old. The economics finally blinked. That's when the levers came out. Stakes first, liquid fuels aren't just energy, they're control systems. Pipelines lock in take or pay contracts that sit under municipal budgets. Refinery throughput props up debt. Ports and tank farms are bargaining chips in elections. If a town can print 5,000 barrels a day from wind and waste, the leverage moves from maps to weather reports. If a base can make its own jet fuel, convoys shrink, and so does the room for pressure. Action looked like this. In 2019, a municipal waste-to-energy plant on the plains plumbed its stack. They captured Fluco 2 that used to drift into the sky, signed a night-rate deal for surplus wind, and fed green hydrogen with captured carbon into a shipping container reactor with ruthenium-doped catalysts tuned for Fischer-Tropsch. Out came a steady stream of synthetic diesel that met ASTM D975. The city buses ran cleaner. Mechanics logged normal wear. The mayor cut a ribbon beside a placard that said circular. Then emails got strange. The grid operator reopened their interconnection study over harmonics concerns from electrolyzers they'd already modeled. An insurance writer doubled premiums for novel process risk. A regional refinery offered a strategic partnership. The city declined. Weeks later, a venture fund tied to midstream interests bought a controlling stake. A pause for optimization became a strategic review. Staff told friends the unit hit spec. The public line said timing. Meanwhile, defense ran the same play without press. A coastal base used off-peak nuclear at night to split hydrogen, pulled CO2 from seawater with membranes, and synthesized JP8. Engines wore normally, sulfur surprises never arrived. Reports stayed inside, orders did not. The point wasn't carbon virtue, it was logistics. Fuel made at the edge doesn't need an escort. In aviation, a catalyst shop cracked a cheaper path to e-kerosene at modest pressure. In 2021, an airline blended 10% at one airport tank farm for a week. Pilots noticed nothing, which was the win. Then came the familiar pivot. An oil-aligned investment vehicle took majority control. The new CEO reframed the business as carbon management services. The airline renegotiated supply timing. Scientists got retention packages and new titles. The plant slipped into slide decks. Stakes hit spreadsheets people don't show in hearings. If a city can produce a slice of diesel locally, pipeline tariffs lose bite. If regional airports can blend their own kerosene, supply shocks soften. If ports can turn captured CO2 and cheap wind into bunker fuel, routes and rates shift. Each percent made locally isn't just a carbon story, it's a leverage story. Resistance arrived dressed as prudence. Permits stalled on novel emissions characterization for units with no net emissions beyond what they consumed. Interconnect reviews looped as standards committees harmonized requirements for power quality filters already installed. Insurance underwriters priced risk as if every vessel might explode. None of it said no. All of it said not yet. Then narrative joined. A think tank with donors in the usual places published Net Zero Theater, arguing synthetic fuels entrench combustion. True in one slice. Also true, fleets don't evaporate when you pass a bill. Airframes fly for decades. Diesel engines haul food. You can't swap every turbine and truck on a schedule that pleases a press release. A bridge fuel that drops into existing hardware isn't theater, it's triage. Micro stories cut the abstractions. A fishing co-op on a volcanic island used surplus geothermal to split hydrogen, captured CO2 from a brewery, and blended fuel for boats. Diesel shipments dropped 18% in 6 months. Their distributor suddenly offered loyalty discounts. Their bank asked for updated collateral valuations tied to their fuel contracts. Credit is a lever too. In a desert city, a utility signed a night rate PPA to feed a CO2 to methanol unit serving delivery fleets. County permits cleared. State approval stalled over a year-long stacked data request for a test variance measured in months. The variance was for testing. The loop ate itself. The startup burned cash, then accepted an acquisition with a familiar clause, portfolio alignment. Limits exist. Electrolyzers want cheap power around the clock. Catalysts foul and need regeneration. Carbon capture from air is expensive, from flue gas and seawater easier but still not free. Storage and blending need real oversight. But those are engineering curves and they're bending. PEM costs fall with factory scale. Solid oxide units like heat, modular reactors don't need refineries to justify themselves, and catalysts now live longer between refreshes. The unusual pattern isn't physics, it's tempo. When the math starts to pencil, someone moves the goalposts. Impact shows up in emergencies. A winter storm iced highways, tankers idled offshore. A hospital's diesel tank ran low. In a utility yard, a mothballed synth unit still had bottled CO2 and a rack of hydrogen. A technician spun it up and drummed 20 gallons by midnight. The ICU stayed lit. No press release. Just a machine doing what pipelines couldn't that night. The aftertaste is policy. If you want synthetic fuels to be more than ribbon cuts, lock the choke points open. Write interconnect rules that can't be reopened mid-pilot. Create insurance pools for certified units so novelty doesn't price out reality. Publish performance and emissions to public registries so smears have to argue with data, not vibes. And keep ownership distributed enough that buyouts can't bury a catalyst in a portfolio nap. Because once a town replaces even a slice of imports with molecules made from its own wind and waste, the barrel stops being a permission slip and starts being a preference. And preferences are hard to police. Forbidden medicine, cures that break business models. Energy is the invoice you see. Medicine is the invoice you live. The system runs on returns, follow-ups, refills, routine. Anything that ends the routine threatens the rent. So the cures arrive like contraband, older than antibiotics, sharper than chemo, and engineered to be one and done. Start with precision hunters that predate penicillin. In 1923, clinicians in Tbilisi used bacteriophages, viruses that kill bacteria and then vanish, to clear infections nobody could medicate. A century later, the biology is stronger and the paperwork heavier. A girl in 2017 ran out of antibiotics after a surgical infection learned new tricks. A clinician matched her strain against a freezer library, blended 3 phages, and shipped a vial. 2 days after infusion, the smell of the wound changed before the labs did. Insurance reimbursed nothing. The chart read, improvement coincident with therapy. The family framed the empty bottle. Here's the mismatch. Regulators approve a fixed drug with a single label. Phages are libraries that adapt. Every cocktail update looks like a new product on paper, even when it's the same process in practice. Hospitals hide behind vendor lists with no column for tailored virus. Companies patent manufacturing and delivery, then meet a clock, burn rate versus guidance that doesn't fit. A gleaming facility opened in 2019 promising overnight matching. An agency asked for comparability data on updates. Weeks became quarters. A strategic investor bought control, pivoted to adjacent indications, and parked the rest. The stakes aren't academic. Antibiotic resistance isn't a graph, it's a bed number. When drugs fail, phages can chase a moving target in hours and replicate at the infection site. They're not perfect, they're fast, but speed doesn't map to codes. Reimbursement wants phase 3 trials with identical bottles and long horizons. Families write their own logistics. Swabs to Georgia, couriers across borders, consent forms taller than the patient. Then diagnostics that move disease left on the timeline. Not sci-fi tricorders, quiet carts and tubes. Liquid biopsies read tiny shards of tumor DNA in blood. Methylation maps guess tissue of origin with probabilities that sharpen as datasets grow. Breath analyzers pick volatile organic compound patterns linked to cancer or fibrosis on benches that used to live only in gas chromatography labs. In 2021, a high-risk smoker in a regional pilot blew a pattern that annoyed a nurse practitioner enough to push for imaging. The scan found a nodule the size of a pea, surgery instead of cycles. She went home Monday. A chemo chair stayed empty for winters. Hospitals can do the math. Late-stage care pays for wings, early-stage cures empty rooms. Procurement asks payers for coverage. Payers want decade outcomes. Decade outcomes require deployment now. Risk committees ask who owns false positives. It asks where the data lives. GPOs ask if the analyzer is on their list. A pilot ends with cake and a press photo. The cart goes back in a box. Everyone says promising. The calendar says no. Now the one-and-dones. A sickle cell patient who lived inside ER hallways for years got a CRISPR edit in 2023. Pain crises faded into memory he didn't trust at first. Then billing began. How do you price never again in a system built to average risk across quarters? Manufacturers offer outcomes guarantees. Employers balk because people switch jobs. Medicaid wants miracles at a price that funds none. The clinic waits for authorization. The patient waits for Friday to feel like Friday. Cell therapies try to dodge bespoke traps. Off-the-shelf natural killer cells trained to hunt universal signals aim for repeatable manufacturing. Early solid tumor cohorts show durable responses in small numbers. Choke points move to capacity and IP. A method patent claims adequate persistence. Then adequacy becomes a courtroom word. Trials pause pending supply harmonization. Patients track news like weather. Printed organs hover between bench and bedside. Bioprinters lay down bioinks, cells on scaffolds with growth factors, to mimic tissues that pass preclinical tests. Livers detox in animals, hearts beat in scaffolds, kidneys show filtration surrogates. Regulators reasonably want potency assays that predict human outcomes, matched lots, long surveillance. Committees form. Frameworks lag. A child on a list hears "not yet" from a device that exists in a chilled box 60 feet away. Closed-loop devices cut a different rent. Disposables and data. A glucose implant with multi-month life talks to a pump that learns. Code becomes the business model. A firm merges, forces cloud logins, and deprecates offline mode for safety. A small clinic runs open firmware, loses parts support, and watches patients who finally sleep through the night choose between privacy and updates. Across all of it, the language is gentle and the effect is hard. Insufficient evidence. Experimental. Pathway unclear. Truth, some claims won't hold. Caution matters. Also truth, evidence takes time you only get by using the thing. When the thing ends a revenue stream, time runs slower. Still, cracks widen. A military hospital publishes a phage case series. A state Medicaid pilot covers multi-cancer blood screens for narrow groups with navigation baked in. A co-op of employers pools risk for gene edits and lets coverage travel with the patient for 5 years, so switching jobs stops killing authorizations. An outcomes registry goes public by default. Smears have to argue with receipts, not rumors. One micro-story to hold. A man with a printed scaffold in his spine lifts his daughter and waits for the bolt of pain that trained him to flinch. Nothing. He laughs in a kitchen that's heard the other sound for years. An email arrives. Program paused pending supplier changes. He sets his phone down and keeps laughing anyway. That's the threat. Not flashy immortality. Quiet ends to bills that were never meant to end. Precision pathogens, phage therapies return and retreat. The chart read like a countdown. Fever up, creatinine creeping, cultures blooming the wrong names. On day 8, the pharmacist said the thing people whisper when the cabinet's empty. There's a lab in Tbilisi that can match phages. The attending raised an eyebrow. The family didn't. A swab left on ice. To understand why that call matters, we need to go back a century. In the 1920s and 1930s, clinicians in Georgia and Poland used bacteriophages, viruses that hunt specific bacteria, to clear infections before penicillin made one-size pills the business model. It wasn't magic, it was matchmaking. You isolate the patient's strain, test a library, blend a cocktail, and deliver bullets that replicate at the infection site and vanish when the target is gone. It's fast, personal, and stubbornly hard to fit into a system built for identical bottles with barcodes. Stakes first, antibiotic resistance isn't a headline, it's a bed number. When the last resort fails, you don't need a perfect drug, you need something that can outrun a microbe that just outran a century of chemistry. Phages can. They adapt on the same timescale as the bacteria. That speed is the cure. It's also the paperwork problem. The vial arrived 4 days after the swab. In a basement pharmacy, a tech checked titers, a nurse read a consent form that felt like a novella, and a clear bag started to drip. The first clue wasn't a lab value. It was the smell. Wounds have a vocabulary. This one lost its worst word overnight. 48 hours later, CRP broke, fever bent, and a tired mother slept in a chair for the first time in a week. The progress note was careful. Clinical improvement coincident with phage therapy. Insurance reimbursed nothing. The bottle went home empty and got a place on a shelf. What nobody outside the hallway saw was how quickly the retreat began. The next patient's strain didn't match the lab's library. Importing new phages would trigger a review that could take weeks. An IRB wanted protocol language that didn't exist yet. Pharmacy needed a vendor ID for a supplier that wasn't on any list. The hospital attorney asked who held liability if a virus updated mid-course. Reasonable questions, lethal timing. Manufacturing sat at the heart of the mismatch. You can't patent a virus found in a river, but you can patent how you purify it, package it, and maintain your library. Companies raised rounds on platforms, make, match, ship overnight, and ran into a framework built for fixed products. Every cocktail update looked on paper like a new drug. In 2019, a gleaming facility opened with gowns that whispered and stainless steel that gleamed. An email from regulators asked for comparability data on updates. Weeks turned to quarters. Burn rates don't care about guidance documents. A strategic investor bought control and pivoted to adjacent indications. The library stayed cold. Clinicians hacked where they could. Compassionate use letters stacked. Sample tubes left for research when vendor lists said no. Families built group chats with couriers, phone numbers, and time zones. A military hospital published a small case series, multi-drug-resistant wound infections that finally cooled, and a congressional staffer waved the paper at a hearing. Agencies murmured about platform approvals and master files for phage libraries. The murmur moved slower than sepsis. Then the smear cycle. Hype outpaces evidence. The body of the article was careful, heterogeneous cases, variable manufacturing, small n, but the headline did the work. Committees took the safest path, wait for Phase 3. Phase 3 requires standardization phages don't respect and inclusion criteria made of edge cases. Patients learned a new phrase for not now. Meanwhile, the science didn't stop. Labs built faster assays to test lytic spectra. QA teams shortened sterility checks with validated rapid methods. A university ran a registry that turned anecdotes into time-stamped outcomes. Organism, susceptibility, cocktail, dose, day-by-day labs. Transparency blunted rumor. Procurement still asked for codes. Payers wanted randomized mortality data. Mortality data needed time no one had. Micro-stories carried the weight. In a burn unit, irrigation with a matched cocktail lifted a biofilm like wet paint. A surgical resident took a photo, labeled it education, and never put it on a slide. In a long-term care facility, a woman with a stubborn urinary infection stopped cycling antibiotics after a pocket nebulizer delivered a phage blend on Fridays. A compliance officer asked where the invoices should go. There weren't any. Limits are real. Bacteria evolve, phages can select resistance. Immunogenicity matters, endotoxin limits are unforgiving, titers drop on the shelf, timelines slip when flights do. But those are engineering problems. They bend with use. What bends slower is permission. Frameworks that approve processes instead of molecules exist for cell and gene therapies, but they're expensive roads with tolls in lawyers and time. Impact shows up where optics don't reach. A regional network wrote a playbook. When the ID team hits the wall, pull a lab's library under a research umbrella, log every variable to a public registry, and let the outcomes argue with the labels. A state pilot funded matching for last resort cases with coverage tied to the registry, not a press release. A small manufacturer published their sops under a permissive license and dared copycats. Instead of a lawsuit, they got a purchase order. The last moments stay human. A teenager who'd stopped planning weekends watched a bag drip while a nurse checked a phone for an email that would say whether the next vial could legally land. The fever line bent. The email didn't. She went home anyway with follow-ups and a list of numbers that looked like a smuggler's ledger. The therapy didn't fit the system. It fit her. And that's why the system stalled. Early detection that ends entire markets. The machines didn't promise immortality. They promised to move bad news left months or years earlier, where surgery beats drips and bills get smaller instead of larger. That shift sounds clinical until you sit in the room where budgets live. Early detection doesn't just save lives, it erases revenue forecasts built on late-stage care. Start with blood, 2 tubes, spun down and read like a whisper. Circulating tumor DNA is confetti from dying cells, too sparse for old tools but legible when sequencers and methylation maps do the translation. In 2021, a union employer in the Midwest piloted multi-cancer screening for high-risk members. A woman flagged pancreas-like at low probability. Standard imaging shrugged. A careful follow-up found a pea-sized lesion tucked in a spot most scans ignore. Friday morning, a surgeon worked quietly. Monday, she went home. 3 winters passed without a chair. Stakes are simple. Catch at stage I and chemo lines empty. That emptiness echoes infusion staffing, pharmacy revenue, imaging cadence, bed turnover. A hospital's CFO can read that tide and feel their capital plan wobble. So procurement asks payers for coverage codes. Payers ask for decade-long mortality data. Mortality data requires deploying now. Risk management asks who owns false positives. Legal asks where custody sits. It asks which cloud owns the raw. Everyone nods. The cart waits on a loading dock. Breath looked like folklore until arrays and models made patterns honest. Disease changes metabolism. Metabolism changes volatile organic compounds. Exhale carries the signature. In 2022, a safety net system rolled a breath cart next to low-dose CT for heavy smokers. 1,000 tests, a dozen subtle signals, and surgeons with quiet grins. Finance wanted payer commitments. Payers said experimental. The manufacturer offered a lease. The group purchasing organization didn't list the vendor. The analyzer left with a thank you sheet cake and a promise to evaluate next budget cycle. Limits are real. Blood screens raise false alarms, breath varies with diet, meds, humidity, but engineering curves bend. Panels add context, thresholds adapt, confirmatory pathways tight. The bigger fight isn't sensitivity, it's incentives. A device that compresses downstream care doesn't belong to the side of the house that gets paid by the hour. A micro story hits harder than any chart. A county clinic served firefighters after a brutal season. A donor covered a year of breath tests tied to swift imaging when the signal insisted. Month 1, a captain who'd skipped scans for years blew a pattern a nurse couldn't ignore. The nodule was small enough to cut before it could bill a decade. He called his crew from recovery. They showed up on a day off and stared at the cart like it was a person. When the grant ended, 3 payers wrote no, 2 wrote appeal, and no one wrote a check. Blood labs ran into codes, the quiet turnstiles of American medicine. To get paid, you need a CPT code with a policy, and policies want trials whose ethics go sideways once you know early is better. A national lab chain tried an opt-in methylation screen in 2023 through employers. Uptake climbed until an insurer sent a concern memo about unproven utility. The toggle moved behind a request button most people never find. Numbers dipped. Headlines never ran. Hospitals that tried anyway learned to hide success in the right ledger. One integrated system built a prevention bundle, blood screen plus navigation for their own staff, then for a city contract. Stage shifts appeared, surgical theater booked more mornings, chemo chairs sat emptier. The CFO quarantined results in a value-based silo so fee-for-service lines didn't set the policy. The silos barely spoke. The program survived on stubbornness and a union steward who refused to sit down. Vendors found themselves fighting ghosts. A breath device lives best with data on-prem, fast, private, resilient. It insisted on cloud analytics for observability. The hospital's legal team asked for audit logs and deletion schedules. The device answered, local storage rotating. The meeting paused. The device went back to a crate while committees waited for a safer phrasing of the same truth. You don't need the cloud to smell trouble. The smear cycle arrived right on schedule. Overpromising blood tests mislead patients. Some claims deserved the hammer. One dead unicorn had poisoned half the well. but careful screens with peer-reviewed panels got tarred by adjacency. Finance chiefs forwarded the headline to committees looking for reasons to sit still. Manufacturers countered with white papers and comparative studies. The safest decision stayed the slowest one. Workarounds multiplied where people were tired of funerals. Self-insured employers wrote coverage with navigation baked in and agreed to pay only when signals led to validated findings. A state Medicaid pilot funded breath for specific groups with smoking histories and paired it with nurse-driven follow-up. Outcomes slid into public dashboards, arguments turned into data. A radiology chair went from skeptic to quiet champion after a month of nodules that used to arrive 2 years too late. The human beats kept pace with the spreadsheets. A machinist whose father died at 58 blew a breath test at 53, complained about nothing, and found a shadow that hadn't learned to spread. He missed 1 week of work and returned to a job that never budgeted for a drip. An oncology nurse sat in a half-empty suite on a Tuesday and didn't know whether to feel pride or panic. She chose pride and applied to supervise navigation. What nobody knew at the time: a small city wrote an RFP for local-first diagnostics that banned forced clouds and required public outcomes reporting. Vendors with dashboards balked. A quiet firm that made carts with no monthly fee won the bid, installed in 2 clinics and published stage shifts quarterly. The press didn't care. Patients did. Early detection isn't a gadget war. It's a timeline war. Move disease left and everything on the right loses gravity. The people who sit on that side aren't villains. They're bound to budgets built on yesterday. The cure for that isn't slogans. It's receipts that show fewer funerals and a procurement clause that refuses to rent the privilege of catching trouble in time. Regenerative One-and-Dones, repairs instead of refills. The idea sounded simple enough to make enemies. Repair once, then stop paying. In clinics and quiet labs, 3 fronts pushed that promise from posters into rooms. Gene edits that end inherited pain, off-the-shelf immune cells that hunt without bespoke kitchens, and printed scaffolds that teach tissue how to finish the job. Stakes first, healthcare budgets live on rhythm, visits, refills, follow-ups, complications. A therapy that cancels the calendar isn't just medicine, it's a wrecking ball through receivables. That truth didn't arrive in a memo. It arrived in a chair where a teenager sat with a pen he'd forgotten how to hold without bracing for a shock. Action began in a glass room with his quiet air. In 2023, a young man with sickle cell took a single dose that carried a correction to the punctuation error embedded in his blood since birth. Weeks later, the pain crises that taught him to count hospital ceilings didn't show. He kept waiting for the old pattern. It didn't come. His nurse cried before his mother did. Then the billing started. The price looked like a house. The manufacturer offered outcomes guarantees. The plan sponsor wanted decade horizons while members switched jobs yearly. A case manager whispered, "We're trying," and the word hung like a string over a canyon. Meanwhile, off-the-shelf natural killer cells sidestepped the custom trap. Instead of farming a patient's own T cells and hoping they cooperated, engineers trained NK cells in vats to spot stress signals tumors can't hide forever. Doses standardized. Logistics simplified. Early solid tumor cohorts saw responses that didn't read like wishful thinking. Capacity became the choke point, then IP. A facility bottleneck turned into a method patent argument over persistence adequate for durable effect. Adequate moved from bench to courtroom. Trials paused, pending harmonization. Patients who'd shaved their heads in hope refreshed inboxes. Printed scaffolds told a quieter story in orthopedics and organs. Bioprinters laid down bioinks, cells, factors, degradable frameworks, in patterns that coaxed bodies to remember how to be whole. A man with a degenerative lumbar disc joined a trial for a scaffold seeded with his own cells. 3 months later, he buttoned a shirt without planning his day around a pill. The study coordinator texted a thumbs-up emoji. Hours later, an email landed. Enrollment temporarily paused pending supplier audit. The pause outlived a season. His hand didn't. Stakes sit in spreadsheets, but they show up as people. A pain clinic traded bottle by bottle for a closed-loop implant, sensor cuff algorithm that learned individual signals and shut them down. Patients slept. Refills vanished. Then code became custody. A merger pushed a cloud login. Offline mode was deprecated for safety. The clinic balked. The vendor deprioritized parts. Consent forms mutated into keys people didn't want to hold. What nobody outside committee rooms saw was how often the breaks arrived as process, not verdict. Regulators asked right questions. potency assays that predict outcomes, matched manufacturing lots, surveillance horizons long enough to catch rare harm. Reasonable singly, lethal in sequence when payroll runs weekly. Guidance for platform approvals existed in cell and gene therapy lanes, but tolls were measured in lawyers, assays, and years. Venture capital wanted recurring revenue. These tools wanted to leave. Spreadsheets rolled their eyes. Insurance finished the triangle. Self-insured employers flirted with gene therapy writers, then stepped back when actuaries drew cliffs. Medicaid programs loved outcomes, hated sticker shock, and needed guarantees in a world where budgets rotated with elections. Manufacturers offered pay over time with clawbacks for failure. CFOs asked, "Who pays when the patient moves?" The patient stood by a phone that didn't ring. Still, some cracked the shell. A county health co-op pooled risk across employers for one-and-done therapies with durable outcomes past 2 years and wrote rules that let coverage travel with the person for 5. A small union backed it. Their trustees voted. The first sickle cell edits cleared authorization without a pleading fax. In orthopedics, a state lab partnered with 2 hospital printers, serialized scaffolds, logged batches to a public registry, and invited oversight into the room. The first 5 spines and 3 cartilage patches reported functional gains at 6 months. Names hidden, outcomes visible. Smears had to argue with graphs. A micro story made the stakes plain. A teacher with a tremor that made signatures painful received an off-the-shelf cell infusion in a small neuro trial, not a cure, a control. Her hand steadied enough to write hall passes without apology. The sponsor hit a supply dispute on the method patent. Enrollment pause landed on a Friday. She wrote one more pass and sat in her car with the engine off for a long time. Limits are honest. Edits can miss. Immune systems misbehave. Scaffolds fail in the wrong microenvironment. Manufacturers slip. Long-term effects need long-term eyes. But those are engineering curves. Nothing bends them like use. And nothing slows use like locking a cure behind a business model that bills by the month. Impact lives where bills used to. A hospital oncology suite posted fewer cycles on Tuesdays and redeployed nurses to navigation. A rehab floor took fewer readmissions and bought more therapy bands. A payer's dashboard printed slopes that moved the right way and stayed public. In the background, emails kept using the same words: experimental, insufficient, unclear, while hands learned to open jars again. The last beat is small. A father with a printed scaffold in his neck bent to tie a shoe, waited for white light and found plain silence. His daughter asked if he was okay. He laughed. A notice arrived, program under review due to supplier changes. He tied the other shoe. The review could wait. His life would not. Control-killing information tech. Cut the power, stall the cures, now choke the signal. That's the last rail. Whoever owns the pipes can nudge what you see when you speak and whether your proof counts. But a trio of technologies kept slipping the leash. Meshes that reroute themselves, chips that think where the data lives, and math that proves facts without handing over lives. Each one pulls a brick from the gatehouse. Start with networks that don't ask permission. In a blackout, a neighborhood sideloaded a quiet app that taught phones to whisper over Bluetooth and Wi-Fi direct, hop by hop, until messages reached the next block. No towers, no bars, just pockets carrying news, med lists, and insulin instructions. 2 days later, carriers came back. A week later, security hardening, updates blocked sideloading on municipal devices unless they enrolled in a portal with a fee and a clause allowing remote disable to preserve network integrity. The clause does the work. It's a kill switch with a polite hat. What nobody on that block knew: an overseas protest city had already run meshes at scale, rooftop relays, phone-to-phone routes, offline maps. Takedown orders hit app stores. Firmware builds from certain carriers disabled tethering unless SIMs were blessed. Nothing stopped the street from breathing anyway. The backbone wasn't a switch, it was people. Then the quieter fight in radios themselves. Open basebands promised the last opaque layer, code you could audit, fix, refuse. Certification sat like a wall. Specs hid behind paywalls. Test houses failed projects for the same edge cases incumbents mitigated with brand exemptions. Founders took deals. Licensed the closed stack, shipped product, promised to reopen later. Later drowned in support tickets and payroll. While that was happening, another lever moved the compute away from choke points. Analog accelerators and neuromorphic boards did recognition and control at milliwatts. A field medic carried a palm ultrasound. A neuromorphic module flagged subtle valve issues right there. No cloud, no per scan fee, no stream to subpoena. A plant swapped a smart camera that rented analytics for a fingernail-sized analog chip that spotted defects on the line. Scrap dropped. Uploads disappeared. Their cloud vendor offered transition credits to ease the return. The manager framed the email. Edge autonomy isn't just cheaper, it's harder to police. If the only output is door unlock or leak here, there's no feed to throttle or scrape. That's when policies arrive wrapped in good words. Observability that means send everything to us. Safety analytics that require cloud logins for devices that don't need them. Compliance that bakes a billable pipeline into procurement. Now the trust machine, zero knowledge proofs. Banks ask for dossiers, platforms want everything. Regulators demand retention just in case. ZK says, prove the rule without showing the data. Over 21 resident in this district, assets above threshold, yes or no, with math a third party can verify. A credit union piloted age checks in 2022. Tap a wallet card, terminal lights green, no birth date on screen, no copy to steal. A regulator toured and asked for data retention for audit. Retaining nothing was the point. The memo asked for a log that didn't exist. Newsrooms found the same edge. A source signed documents with a key anchored in a tamper-evident log. Editors verified origin and integrity without ever seeing identity. The story ran. Demands for names met proofs instead of files. The legal fight moved from who to whether the math is valid, which is a quieter place to stand. Finance flirted, then flinched. An exchange proved reserves exceeded liabilities without exposing balances. Users cheered. Auditors requested traditional attestations too, which meant full internal views through a custodian. The proof shrank to a press day, math as theater, control as practice. A draft bill proposed accepting privacy-preserving checks only if a certified intermediary retained raw data. That single clause turned math back into custody. Publishing learned to outlast takedowns by living everywhere. Content addressed networks like IPFS and Arweave mirrored files across nodes. Clinics and reporters pinned hashes so documents stayed reachable even when a gateway went dark. The counterplay shifted to pipes. Raise egress pricing, block gateways, squeeze mirrors. People saw bills, not politics. Nodes dimmed until libraries and unions pooled bandwidth and taught neighborhoods to run their own pins. The files didn't care which door they left. The pattern stayed boring and ruthless. When you can't outlaw, out-administer. Certification fees, liability fears, app store rules, carrier locks, security updates that quietly remove local choice. Interest, pressure, pause. Limits exist. Mesh hops stall without density. Analog drifts with temperature. ZK proofs take compute and wallets get lost. But these are engineering curves, they bend with use. What bends slower is permission. So the cracks matter. A city CIO banned remote disable clauses in router buys and shipped assigned municipal mesh build residents could audit. A water district demanded local first analytics in RFPs and paid bonuses for no cloud. A labor co-op ran private votes with ZK credentials and a public audit trail no one could fake. A newsroom published hashes with every source doc and invited readers to pin. Each move makes the choke points dumber. Keep the human line in front. A teenager in a blackout texted her neighbor through a mesh the carrier didn't own. An elder's heart patch learned on the nightstand and buzzed before the room tilted. A whistleblower slept because a proof carried weight where a file would have burned them. Small freedoms stacked. Gatekeepers call it fragmentation. People who live under bills call it breathing. Mesh networks that refuse to die. The first message shouldn't have arrived. Power out, towers down, but a kid on Maple typed, milk, bread, insulin, and it popped 3 blocks away on a neighbor's phone. No bars, no carrier, just an app that taught phones to whisper over Bluetooth and Wi-Fi direct, hop by hop, until the words landed. Streetlights were dead. The street was. Stakes were immediate. Pharmacies don't fill if scripts can't reach the counter. Dispatchers can't route if radios choke. Families can't split and stay in touch without a thread. In a blackout, information is oxygen, and someone had just found a way to breathe without a tank. What nobody on that block knew was how long this idea had been waiting. Fire seasons pushed volunteers to loft relays from church steeples. Floods taught towns to string line of sight links between rooftops. The difference now was density in pockets. Radios every few meters, batteries everywhere, code that treats distance like a puzzle it enjoys solving. A city IT director tried to bless it. He sideloaded the mesh app onto municipal androids, sanitation, parks, fire, and handed them out with a grin. It worked. Crews coordinated in dead zones, hydrant checks logged on time, shelters found blankets faster. Then came a security hardening update. Sideloading died unless devices enrolled in a portal with a monthly fee and a clause that allowed remote disable to preserve network integrity. The clause mattered more than the fee. Overnight, a neighborhood's plan depended on a switch downtown. Meanwhile, across an ocean, a protest city with the air still sharp from gas refused to go quiet. Carriers throttled, app stores pulled downloads, firmware from certain brands killed tethering unless the SIM was blessed. The street answered with rooftop relays, phone-to-phone paths, and paper maps with QR codes that taught you routes when the network slept. Police scanners filled with requests for locations that never arrived. The backbone wasn't a switch, it was a crowd. Back home, the mesh found domestic chores. A rural co-op mounted LoRa repeaters on silos, stitched neighborhoods with phone hops, and taught volunteers to flash firmware in the library basement. When a blizzard snapped poles, irrigation alerts still moved, vet calls still landed, and a checklist for an old generator reached the only neighbor who knew its trick. A week later, envelopes arrived. Unapproved equipment. Interference risk. A friendly reminder that all networked endpoints must authenticate. The harvesters that only listened were accused of speaking. The phones that spoke to neighbors were told to get permission. Certification turned into a wall you couldn't see until you hit it. Specs sat behind paywalls, tests cost startup budgets, edge cases the incumbents failed became showstoppers without a logo. A founder heard the same pitch 3 times. License our certified stack, pennies per device. Pennies multiply when your plan was 0 and your promise was control that lives at the edge. Micro-stories kept the thread human. An elevator jammed between floors during a storm. Emergency phones were dead. A teenager typed door 7 stuck, 4 inside, 1 older, short of breath. The message hopped to a stairwell node, then to a super's phone in the lobby, then to a firefighter 10 blocks away. The door opened with a bar. A man sat down and breathed. No viral video, just a mesh doing what slogans don't. Another night, a block captain rolled a small generator to a corner where an elderly couple couldn't leave. The mesh carried a grocery list and a reminder about a cat on a balcony. When the carrier returned, the neighborhood didn't rush back. Someone noticed, and firmware hardened again. Vendors found subtler levers. Consumer routers shipped with dormant mesh features disabled by default. A hurricane woke them. Neighbors' Wi-Fi nodes gossiped. Battery packs kept them alive, and the block traded news without the internet. 3 days later, the ISP pushed a patch that addressed a vulnerability and disabled the mesh. Patch notes didn't mention the outage, it had just survived. Open basebands offered a deeper exit. Radios you could audit and refuse kill switches on. Test houses failed them for showing the same quirks closed stacks, mitigated. Teams licensed the old code and promised to reopen later. Later drowned in payroll. Limits exist. Mesh hops need density and patience. Battery life matters. People move, buildings absorb, and Bluetooth is moody. But these are engineering curves, not commandments. Neighborhoods learn to anchor relays on light poles, swap spare battery packs at a bodega, and run bulletin boards on a cheap single-board computer powered by a lawn battery. The rule was simple. Keep a local copy of what you need and let the network heal faster than it breaks. Impact rippled in quiet numbers. Storm after storm, 911 call volumes dipped in pockets where meshes carried triage questions before panic became sirens. A clinic sent lab results over a block-wide hop so patients didn't drive in for nothing. A union hall organized a vote window with routes that didn't show up on a carrier report. Policy learned to speak in euphemisms. Reduce fragmentation, streamline certification, align with safety frameworks. Each phrase wrapped the same move, attach a leash. A city CIO wrote procurement clauses that banned remote disable provisions and required a municipal build residents could verify. Another town posted its mesh firmware with signatures anyone could check, then taught people to install it on Saturday mornings. Security arguments lost air in sunlight. The last line stays small. A nurse walking home under dead lights sent 2 messages, one about a dog on a balcony, one about soup, and both arrived because the block decided to carry them. No bars, no permission, no pause. The mesh refused to die because it remembered what networks are for. Analog and neuromorphic computing come back. While meshes taught neighborhoods to route around choke points, another rebellion unfolded inside the chips themselves. Instead of shipping every frame, beep, and heartbeat to a distant server and renting the answer back, engineers pushed decisions to the edge, right where the signal lives. The tools were old ideas with new teeth. analog accelerators that compute with currents and voltages, and neuromorphic boards that think in spikes like nervous systems. The cloud called this offline mode. Plants, clinics, and crews called it works when the pipe doesn't. Stakes first, cloud AI isn't just a fee, it's custody. If your door camera needs a data center to decide friend from stranger, someone else controls latency, uptime, and logs. Move that logic into a chip that sips milliwatts, wakes only on change, and stores nothing but counts and decisions, and the choke points vanish. No stream to throttle, nothing to subpoena, a lot less to bill. Action started on lines that don't tolerate lag. A factory swapped a rented smart camera plus dashboard for a fingernail analog array. It learned defects as voltages, multiplied weights as currents, and flagged rejects in under 10 milliseconds. Scrap dropped. Uploads disappeared. The cloud vendor emailed transition credits to ease your return. The plant manager printed it and pinned it above the line as a joke. Meanwhile, in a hospital that hates waiting rooms, a portable ultrasound cart sprouted a neuromorphic module. It watched valves and wall motion and flagged patterns that hint at failure. Right there at the bedside, no per-scan fee, no uplink, no analysis queue. IT asked where the audit lived. On the cart, the cardiologist said. Policy had no drawer for that answer. The pilot survived because the chief of cardiology used it on a weekend and refused to give it back. What nobody outside procurement saw was how often unsupported architecture did the heavy lifting. A public lab handed a palm-sized neuromorphic board to a wildfire crew. The unit listened to wind and vibration, woke only when spikes said change, and warned of a shift seconds before smoke told the same story. Back at headquarters, a legacy vendor explained the chip couldn't integrate with their analytics platform. Integration meant dashboards that sold seats. Edge winds kept rhyming. A water district glued analog classifiers to distribution pipes. They learned leak signatures from noise with a handful of op-amps and a microcontroller that slept between ticks. No waveforms left the site. No monthly observability fee arrived. A prosecutor's office tried to subpoena all audio. There wasn't any, just timestamps and flags. The case went away. Certification became the new lever. Safety buyers demanded deterministic behavior on known workloads. Neuromorphic chips don't march in lockstep, they react. Test houses poked them with GPU playbooks and shrugged. Startups heard the pivot pitch. Ship now with closed cloud analytics, reopen later. Later drowned in support tickets, renewals, and fundraisers. A string of analog compute teams that promised orders of magnitude efficiency got acquired by firms with big cloud P and LS. Roadmaps realigned. Dev kits vanished behind inventory consolidation. Engineers kept their badges. Products slipped into the quarter after next forever. Limits are real. Analog drifts with temperature, spiking nets require new tooling, debugging isn't a printout, it's an oscilloscope and patience. But those are engineering curves. Designers trim drift with calibration and redundancy. Toolchains mature when classrooms get kits. And most problems at the edge are summarize the internet. Their move, stop, alert, assist. Reflex beats rent. Micro stories make it plain. A rural clinic fitted an elder with a neuromorphic heart patch. It learned his arrhythmia in 2 days, then buzzed 30 seconds before the room tilted. He sat, breathed, didn't call an ambulance, and told his granddaughter the patch predicts storms. A month later, the vendor pushed an update that required a cloud login for safety analytics. The clinic rolled it back. Weeks later, offline mode was deprecated. The physician kept a drawer of old firmware like contraband and kept her patients stable. In a warehouse, analog vision watched hands near a hydraulic press. The system killed power in 90 milliseconds. No footage left the floor. No upsell email followed a near miss. A consultant pitched a cloud suite anyway. The safety officer pointed at 10 intact fingers and walked him out. Standards committees adjusted their vocabulary. Security meant remote control. Compliance meant telemetry you never asked for. Observability meant a billable pipe. Procurement templates wired and approved analytics partners and mandatory dashboards. A city quietly rewrote its RFPs. Local first decisions, no forced clouds, logs stored on-prem with rotation, outcomes published quarterly. Vendors with glossy web consoles balked. A boring firm with boards and service manuals won. Streets got safer. Bills got smaller. What nobody knew at the time. A state university released an open analog toolchain. Compilers that turned matrices into layouts, reference designs students could solder, and calibration scripts that didn't need a PhD. High schools built leak detectors, traffic counters, and wildlife monitors that ran for months on coin cells. A year later, The same students filed noise complaints when a city tried to replace their counters with a subscription. Impact is quiet, fewer uploads, faster reflexes, fewer leaks and falls and missed murmurs. The fight isn't features, it's custody. If thinking lives where signals are born, the center loses its favorite lever. And every time a chip decides without asking permission, another invoice never gets printed. Unforgeable proofs, cryptography that ends gatekeepers. The first time math changed a newsroom, it didn't feel like math. A reporter held a document that would end a man's career if it traced back to the wrong desk. The source wouldn't hand over identity, phone, or even a burner email, only a small file and a ritual. Verify the signature against a public key pinned in a tamper-evident log. The editor watched a green light flick on without learning a name. The story ran. Calls came. The proof stayed quiet and unbroken. Stakes first, gatekeepers don't need to be right if they can demand everything. Banks ask for your life to open a door. Platforms ask for all of you to sell you back a corner. Regulators ask for retention just in case, and cases never end. Zero-knowledge proofs answer with a different posture. Prove the rule without handing over the raw. Age over 21, residency in this district, assets above a threshold, documents signed by someone authorized. Yes or no, with math anyone can verify. The verifier learns only the answer, not your life. Action came in pilot rooms that looked boring until you read the logs. In 2022, a credit union tested age checks with wallets on phones. A clerk scanned. The terminal lit green for 21 plus, no dates printed, no scans saved, no clipboard for thieves. Compliance toured and nodded. Then a memo asked for data retention for audit. Retain what? The protocol didn't keep dates. The demand, dressed as prudence, asked the system to break itself. Meanwhile, an exchange staged proof of reserves day. Customers watched Merkle trees fold balances into commitments. Auditors verified liabilities against assets without peeking at accounts. Users relaxed. A week later, a notice requested traditional attestations, which meant handing internal views to a custodian. The proof shrank to theater, math for press, custody for practice. Identity sat at the heart. Self-custody wallets stopped being coin purses and started holding credentials. Diplomas, union cards, resident status, professional licenses. A city ran a housing trial in 2023 using selective disclosure. Applicants proved eligibility ranges without handing over addresses of exes, employer phone trees, or tax PDFs. Fraud dipped. Processing times fell. Procurement forwarded a draft bill tying KYC to licensed custodial intermediaries capable of compliance. Capable meant central. Central meant leash. Publishing learned survival by scattering itself. Reporters pinned files to content-addressed networks like IPFS and Arweave, then published the hashes in plain sight. WAC1 gateway and mirrors rose with the same address. The counterplay moved to pipes, egress pricing spikes, gateway blocks, letters to ISPs. People saw bills, not policy, and nodes went silent, until libraries and unions pooled bandwidth and taught neighborhoods to run pins next to routers. The files didn't care which door they used. Finance hit the edge of courage and stared down. ZK compliance let firms prove they met a rule, capital ratios, liquidity floors, exposure bands, without dumping raw ledgers into vendor vaults. A pilot in 2024 generated weekly proofs consumable in a browser. Risk smiled. Legal asked for look-through rights upon request. The whole point was that there's nothing to look through, only proofs to check. The pilot paused, pending policy alignment. Micro-stories carried the cost. An aid group at a border needed to move funds to families flagged as vulnerable without painting targets on doors. Recipients presented proofs at kiosks, cash dispensed, no lists changed hands. A ministry demanded names. The NGO sent mathematics, accounts froze. The line didn't move for 3 days. Another room, another turn. A union ran a vote with private credentials anchored to members' dues, then posted an audit trail no one could fake and no one could reverse into a list. The losing slate demanded names. There were none, only signatures that validated against a public registry. Anger had nowhere to land but arithmetic. Limits are real. Early proofs were heavy, phones choked. Developers cursed tooling built by wizards for wizards. Curves bent. New systems shaved proof times to seconds on laptops, verification to blinks in browsers. SDKs hid the incantations. Courts began to accept transcripts of protocols and attestations about auditability. One state allowed privacy, preserving age checks for alcohol and online content with zero retention, verified by independent watchers who saw only transcripts and outcomes. Complaints fell. Breaches stopped. Vendors selling identity hoards screamed risky. What nobody in those rooms admitted out loud. Retention for audit is the last fig leaf for custody. Keep the raw, keep the rent. Kill the raw, kill the choke. So the playbook repeats certification fees, liability clauses, app store bans on circumvention, wallet takedowns for unsupported KYC, and guidance that accepts proofs only if someone keeps the originals. The originals are the problem. Impact stays personal. A teenager proved she was old enough for a ride without handing a company her birthday forever. A retiree proved income for a mortgage without feeding a broker a map of every account. A whistleblower slept because a signature in a public log carried weight where a file would have burned them. Gatekeepers call it opacity. The rest of us call it boundaries. Math doesn't overthrow institutions by shouting. It ignores them by working. Every time a green light turns on without a dossier changing hands, custody loses a millimeter of pull. Stack enough millimeters and the leash slips. The 25 impossible technologies, case list with turning points. Energy liberation. Solid-state thermal converters beyond lab DMOS stakes. Factory walls become generators, baseload forecasts sag. Action, a 1950s Bel Era patent family resurfaces. A startup shows milliwatt tiles on hot ducts. A conglomerate buys, narrows claims, and realigns. Impact, pilots recalled. Engineers rotate, prototypes hum off the books. IQ magnetic motors with measured anomaly stakes. Meter logic unravels if excess holds. Action, a university publishes careful calorimetry, replication fenced by NDAs, sponsor pivots to sensing. Impact, papers where method concerns, the rig becomes a rumor. Thin-film solar under $1 W in small run stakes. PPAs lose leverage. Action, tooling purchased, then mothballed post-acquisition. Trade case hikes imports. Impact, 3-year delay, incumbents lock contracts. RF scavengers that make IoT immortal stakes. Batteries, truck rolls, carrier plans. Action, city pilot signs. Managed gateway clause arrives, CTO refuses locks. Impact, product relabeled, developer kit. Tidal microturbines through the permitting May stakes. Local dispatchable kills peaker rents. Action, studies loop between agencies. Impact, capital evaporates, units land in museums. Low-energy nuclear anomalies reframed stakes, baseload without barrels. Action, peer-reviewed excess heat, smear cycle, grants mandate conventional mechanisms. Impact, labs renamed to hydrogen metal heat. Co-2 to fuel catalysts at pilot scale stakes, pipeline finance softens. Action, interconnect reopened, premium spike, majority stake shifts. Impact, optimization becomes review. High-density batteries quietly acquired stakes, storage and EV roadmaps. Action, stealth buy, specs vanish. Impact, team absorbed, milestone TBD. Million-cycle supercapacitors in NDA limbo stakes, replacement cycles shrink. Action, utility demo, exclusivity signed. Impact, nothing ships, legend grows. Forbidden medicine. Personalized phage clinics offshore stakes, antibiotic annuities fade. Action, platform approvals stall, vendor lists block. Impact, families fly, outcomes log in registries, not journals. Multi-cancer blood screens in code purgatory stakes. Late-stage lines dwindle. Action, CPT delays, experimental sticks. Impact, pilots end, chairs stay filled. Breath-based VOC analyzers sideline stakes, earlier resections, fewer drips. Action, GPO exclusions, custody memos. Impact, carts boxed, then leased elsewhere. CRISPR sickle cell one-and-done stakes, lifetime care replaced by a day. Action, outcomes contract stall across payers. Impact, waitlists, then silence. Off-the-shelf NK cells hit IP wall stakes, centralized capacity rents. Action, method suits over persistence. Impact, trials harmonize, momentum cools. Printed organ scaffolds pause stakes, transplant gatekeeping. Action, committees ask for frameworks first. Impact, boxes cold, parents wait. Closed-loop glucose implants and code custody stakes, disposables, data plans. Action, forced clouds, offline deprecated. Impact, clinics hoard old firmware. Non-invasive neuromodulation for chronic pain stakes, pill and visit cadence. Action, insufficient endpoints, no reimbursement. Impact, pilots fade mid-sigh. Control killing information tech. City-scale mesh firmware locks stakes, outage leverage. Action, security blocks sideloading, fees attach. Impact, mesh shrinks to hobbyists until storms. Open basebands priced out stakes. Sim control kill switches. Action, paywalled specs test house traps. Impact, founder's license promise later. Neuromorphic boards stuck at defense stakes, cloud dependency. Action, unsupported architecture stamps. Impact, DMOS, no purchase orders. Analog compute startups acquired pivoted stakes, edge autonomy. Action, cloud-aligned realignment. Impact, dev kits vanish. Open silicon toolchains gated stakes, fab leverage. Action, NDA-only PDKs, tolls, impact, shuttles stall. ZK identity throttled by KYC stakes, custody rents. Action, retention for audit clauses. Impact, math ignored for vaults. Censorship-resistant publishing squeezed stakes, narrative custody. Action, egress pricing gateway blocks. Impact, nodes dim, libraries mirror. Decentralized storage priced at the pipe stakes, archive survival. Action, surprise invoices, abuse flags. Impact, cold storage wins, hot truth slows. The Playbook of Suppression, how it keeps working. By now you can hear the rhythm without me naming it. Interest, pressure, pause. It doesn't arrive as a villain, it arrives as paperwork that smiles. The playbook lives in 4 drawers: rules, liability, money, and narrative, and it gets pulled by people who can stall you without ever saying no. Start with rules because they sound like the high ground. Standards bodies are sold as neutral, but seats cost dues and dues buy vetoes. If your device thinks in spikes, a committee can require deterministic GPU tests. If your mesh heals itself, a spec can declare sideloading unsafe at scale. Specs hide behind paywalls. Test houses mark you down on edge cases the incumbents also fail, except the incumbent's logo buys a waiver. Interconnect studies reopen over harmonics you modeled months ago. Emissions reviews loop because the unit is novel, even when its stack is cleaner than the smokestack it's plugged into. Guidance asks for frameworks that don't exist yet, platform approvals for phage libraries, potency assays for printed organs, radio conformance for open basebands. Committees form, definitions drift, your runway melts. Liability is the velvet rope. Legal teams write memos that turn new modes into lawsuits with waiting rooms. Who owns a misrouted mesh message? Where does the audit live if a bedside chip decides? Who's responsible if a phage updates mid-course? Reasonable questions that become stall tactics when clocks tick in lives and payrolls. Insurers price unknowns like catastrophes. Novel process risk doubles premiums. Uncharacterized electromagnetic signatures demand test categories that don't exist. Carriers insist on remote disable to preserve network integrity, which means if they get nervous, your network goes dark. Hospitals won't touch a device without a decade of follow-up. The device exists to prevent the emergencies that create follow-up data. It's not a hard no. It's a maze that runs on calendar time. Money is where the pauses turn fatal. Reimbursement codes are turnstiles you can't see until your nose hits them. No CPT, no pay, no pay, no patience. No patience, no data, no data, no CPT. Diagnostics that move disease left get labeled experimental and pushed to employer opt-in, then quietly moved behind a button most people never find. On the energy side, interconnect reassessments politely starve pilots. Insurance riders price small synth units out while refineries get grandfathered premiums. Procurement templates hardwire approved analytics partners, making local edge decisions impossible without a billable pipe. Venture capital loves subscriptions. One-and-done therapies fail the spreadsheet question. What's your recurring revenue? Your answer, we leave, is the point, and it scares money away. Narrative closes the triangle and does it with cheap glue. Labels stick. Unscalable, unsafe, pseudoscience, net zero theater, privacy for criminals. Trade press runs cautious takes that lump careful pilots with hucksters. A dead unicorn poisons the well for legitimate blood screens. A century of cranks gives cover to rebrand low-energy nuclear anomalies so grant committees can demand conventional mechanisms and move on. A think tank funded by midstream donors publishes Synthetic Fuels Entrench Combustion. True in a sliver, devastating in a headline. Committees forward links, the safest option sits still. When sticks don't work, the checkbook arrives and smiles. Acquisitions feel like validation. Retention packages, new titles, a promise to amplify impact. Inside the term sheet sits the clause that matters. No independent development of substantially similar technology. Roadmaps realign. Dev kits vanish behind inventory consolidation. Pilot units are recalled for upgrades and never return. Teams keep their badges. The mission gets parked in slides titled TBD. Founders tell themselves they'll reopen later. Later gets eaten by quarterly cadence. A few quieter levers round it out. App stores and firmware act like border guards. 1. Security hardening, toggle and municipal sideloading dies. Egress pricing turns decentralization into a luxury. Storage cheap, movement expensive, so archives stay cold and truth slows. Open Silicon gets fenced by PDKs under NDAs with tolls only big players can pay. Fab shuttles stall for anyone without the right signatures. Even grants act like gravity. Cycles reward novelty over stubborn iteration, and PhD committees prefer clean hypotheses to messy pilots that save lives. People pull these levers, and most aren't villains. A regulator asks hard questions because last year's scandal burned her name. A hospital lawyer blocks a cart because one breach killed a career down the hall. A standards chair pushes a clause because their employer sells dashboards. A founder takes a buyout because payroll beats purity when 12 families depend on Friday. Good people, wrong incentives. The machine doesn't need malice when it has momentum. Watch the sequence assemble itself. Interest sparks. A pilot lights buses on synthetic diesel. A phage lifts a biofilm like wet paint. A mesh carries insulin through a dead block. An analog chip cuts power before a hand finds a press. Pressure follows, standards, liability, procurement, reimbursement. Pause arrives with kind words. We're excited, but the pathway is unclear. While you wait, capital tightens, rivals whisper, a white paper lands with just enough footnotes to give cover, and a strategic partner offers to help you scale responsibly. When you return with answers, the questions have slid 2 inches sideways. There are tells you can spot in the wild. Reopened study usually means someone called someone. Security update often means we removed your autonomy. Retention for audit is code for we want custody. Vendor list is a moat designed to be permanent. If your pilot works and someone calls it unscalable, ask who gets paid if it doesn't scale. If a standard demands a dashboard for a device that decides locally, ask who sells the seats. The antidotes aren't romantic. They're procedural like the problem. Publish transparently so labels must argue with outcomes, not rumors. Public registries for stage shifts, emissions, batch IDs, firmware hashes. Remove single points of failure, no remote kill in procurement. Municipal builds residents can verify multi-vendor supply for the same catalyst or scaffold. Shift buyers, co-ops, unions, public labs, willing to absorb short-term hits for long-term freedom. Pool risks so one-and-dones don't die on quarterly cliffs. Write RFPs that force local first decisions and ban forced clouds. Paywall specs. Fund open toolchains and teach students to use them. Egress throttles, pool bandwidth and teach neighborhoods to pin. Here's the quiet truth the playbook hates. It relies on chokes. Where there's a single pipe, a single portal, a single lab, a single vendor list, a single set of hands on the switch, the pause wins. Distribute the pipes, the proofs, the printers, the pilots, and the pause loses oxygen. The machine thrives on delays dressed as diligence. You break it with receipts, redundancy, and buyers who refuse the leash. Breaking the cycle, the few that slipped through. Some communities stopped asking for permission and changed the paperwork by making it irrelevant. A coastal co-op utility got tired of being reassessed. They financed rooftop solar with neighborhood bonds, tied blocks together with shared batteries, and shipped open islanding firmware signed by the town. When the mainland fell in a storm, lights stayed on block by block. A letter arrived warning of unauthorized configurations. The town posted the code, trained electricians on Saturdays, and wrote into ordinance. No remote kill clauses on municipal gear. Enforcement couldn't find the single switch to flip. There wasn't one. In a hospital system that was done burying anecdotes, families and clinicians built a live registry for last resort infections. Phage strain, bacterial genome doses, day-by-day labs to identified but time-stamped in public. A university borrowed that registry as its IRB backbone. When someone called it insufficient evidence, the evidence talked back in real time. A state pilot tied reimbursement to those receipts, not a press conference. The freezers still hummed. The memos got quieter. A city smoked out takedowns by owning its network. They released a municipal mesh build residents could audit, banned remote disabled terms in procurement, and pre-flashed community routers at libraries. Firmware hardening from carriers didn't land. People had a sign billed from their own city. When storms knocked towers, the block gossiped anyway. Security arguments lost air under sunlight and signatures. Edge compute slipped the leash the same way, by being boring, cheap, and open. A state university published a complete analog and neuromorphic toolkit, compilers, reference boards, calibration scripts. The license forced improvements to stay public. Small factories in 3 countries spun boards for pennies, a water district bought trays and stopped renting dashboards. A big firm tried to buy the lab. The license made it pointless. You can't bury what you don't own. On care that cancels calendars, a county co-op pooled risk across employers for one-and-done therapies with durable outcomes. Coverage traveled with the patient for 5 years, so job changes didn't reset authorization. A union signed first. A school district followed. The first sickle cell edits cleared without a pleading fax. In orthopedics, a public lab partnered with 2 printers, serialized every scaffold, logged batches to a public registry, and invited the regulator to sit in the room. Early outcomes went up on a dashboard anyone could read. Smears had to argue with graphs. Publishing learned to outlive gatekeepers by living everywhere. Reporters paired content addressed networks with civic partners, libraries, unions, clinics to pin primary documents. Gateways went dark, hashes stayed reachable. When egress bills spiked, the consortium pooled bandwidth and taught neighborhoods to run pins next to routers. The story didn't ask a platform for permission. It asked a checksum for truth. Common threads tied these escapes together. Redundancy, no single lever anyone could yank, mirrors, suppliers, signers, sites. Transparency, receipts by default, batch IDs, firmware hashes, stage shifts, uptime. Distribution ownership spread so wide that buyouts and takedowns couldn't silence a technology. None of it was romantic, all of it worked. Founders turned down checks. City CIOs risked careers. Nurses logged outcomes in public. A plant manager framed an email offering transition credits and told his line, "We're not going back." The decision point, your meter, your body, your feed. This lands on your desk in 3 piles. Your meter first. When you replace routers, inverters, thermostats, buy local first gear that works without a cloud leash and publishes its firmware hashes. If a device won't run without a monthly login, walk. Ask installers to enable safe islanding where the code allows. Demand procurement clauses that ban remote kills and forced clouds. If a spec is paywalled, back the open toolchain that replaces it. Now your body. If your plan offers prevention bundles, blood screens or breath tests with navigation, opt in and ask where the outcomes live. Sit on a benefits committee. Pilot coverage with public registries and stage shift dashboards. If there's a waitlist for one-and-done therapies, push your employer to pool risk across employers so coverage can travel with people, not payroll. When a clinic forces clouds for closed-loop devices, ask for offline mode in writing. If they can't provide it, ask why safety requires a subscription. Your feed is the easiest to change, the hardest to keep. Use wallets that do zero knowledge checks, age, residency without hoarding your life. When a platform demands raw data for audit, ask for acceptance of proofs and get the refusal in writing. Mirror the stories that matter, run a pin or fund the library that does. Download the Mesh app before the storm. Teach your block how to sign the city's bill. Keep a local copy of what you need and a habit of verifying what you share. Watch for tells. Security update that removes sideloading. Retention for audit where a proof would do. Vendor list with a moat. Experimental attached to a device that already empties chairs. Ask who gets paid if nothing changes. Ask who can pause you without saying no. Then move money and attention toward receipts, redundancy, and people who refuse the leash. Control survives by turning basics into rents, power, health, proof, and calling the lease safety. But receipts, redundancy, and distribution cut the leash clean. If you want the blueprints and live playbooks, the code, the clauses, the registries, subscribe now. Watch the next film on how these bypasses scale past one town and one clinic, and send this to the person who signs the checks where you live. The sooner they see the levers, the sooner the pause ends.